An unprecedented geopolitical storm is transforming the foundations of the global economy, and here in the United States, it feels as if we are being swept away by an uncontrollable current. In an unexpected turn, three powers, China, India, and Russia, have joined forces to take a step that could radically change the framework of international trade: the total exclusion of U.S. oil from their domestic markets. This ban, though without major public announcements, is creating a silent but powerful impact in Washington, where responses seem increasingly improvised. While the Trump administration intensifies its sanctions, directly targeting Moscow in an attempt to slow its economic recovery, the reality on the ground is far more complex. The Russian currency has not only held steady, but at critical moments has outperformed the dollar itself. This paradox is creating tension within the Treasury Department, on Wall Street, and also in American households, where fuel prices remain unpredictable. According to experts, the ruble has regained unexpected stability, driven by an alternative trade network that no longer relies on the dollar as a fundamental pillar. As politicians in Washington launch more sanction packages, nations of the global South respond surprisingly by diversifying, resisting, and building their own systems. The big question echoing through the halls of power is unsettling. Are we really still setting the rules of global trade? A symbolic example is the 50% tariff imposed on India for its refusal to abandon Russian oil. But rather than retreating, New Delhi openly challenged Washington, reminding that energy security cannot be subject to external pressures. This behavior reflects a profound shift. For decades, economic punishment by the United States was enough to force political changes in nearly any capital worldwide. Today, even our closest allies are seeking independent paths. While the media debates sanctions, the average American citizen, like you and me, begins to wonder who is truly paying for these decisions. Every new conflict, every additional tariff is reflected in supermarket prices, gasoline, and electricity bills. Most concerning is that these measures are no longer achieving the expected geopolitical goals. According to energy policy specialists, Russia has lost access to Europe, yes, but it has redirected its oil to Asia through a parallel fleet of over 600 ships conducting transactions in yuan and rupees. In other words, the economic punishment is having the opposite effect, accelerating the creation of a trade system where the United States is no longer the center. This could be the most decisive moment of our era. A world that has learned to operate without relying on us. Are we prepared for that reality? As we watch the pillars of U.S. influence in global trade slowly weaken, the question many in this country are beginning to ask is whether our foreign policies based on sanctions and tariffs are truly achieving their aims, or, on the contrary, causing a progressive isolation of our own economy. Recent data is revealing. Despite the U.S.-imposed price cap of $60 per barrel on Russian oil, Moscow continues selling large volumes to Asia with calculated discounts, offsetting losses through alternative routes and agreements in non-Western currencies. This adaptive capacity has made sanctions, though strict on paper, lose effectiveness in practice. Some experts suggest that the most significant impact of U.S. sanctions has not fallen on Russia, but on global confidence in the dollar-dominated financial system. Here arises a phenomenon Washington would prefer not to mention openly: de-dollarization. Countries like China, India, Saudi Arabia, and even some NATO allies are exploring ways to trade energy and essential goods without relying on the dollar. It is a slow but steady process, driven by the fear that any nation could become the target of financial sanctions if it does not align with U.S. interests. This profound transformation is already reflected in global markets, especially in agreements between Russia and China. Currently, transactions are mostly conducted in rubles and yuan, while India has begun paying part of its oil in rupees. Even Gulf countries, traditionally aligned with the petrodollar system, have started negotiating crude shipments to Asia with payments in currencies other than the usual ones. This new reality represents a direct challenge to U.S. economic supremacy, which for decades has cemented its global power through control of the international monetary system. What is most alarming is how this global trade war directly impacts our daily lives. In recent months, U.S. importers have experienced a considerable increase in logistics costs, caused by more expensive alternative maritime routes, changes in payment currencies, and difficulty accessing competitively priced oil in Asia. These challenges translate into higher costs for gasoline, fertilizers, plastics, and even processed foods. Meanwhile, the administration continues betting on punitive measures, more sanctions, more tariffs, and increasing pressure on markets. Some experts warn that this strategy may be pushing the world toward a new economic order in which Washington will gradually lose its veto power. Attempts to punish Russia have had the opposite effect, strengthening ties between Moscow, Beijing, and New Delhi. This triangle not only defies sanctions but is creating new networks of trade, technology, and finance. What does this mean for American workers, entrepreneurs, and consumers? It represents a scenario full of uncertainty, where structural inflation, loss of competitiveness, and fragmentation of international trade begin to affect everyday life. Are we really winning this trade war or simply digging a hole that will be hard to escape? The clearest image emerging this year is that of a United States caught between two opposing forces. On one side, the desire to maintain its role as the arbiter of international trade. On the other, the unstoppable rise of alternative economic blocs that no longer fear challenging that authority. The latest trigger was India's unprecedented decision, tacitly supported by China and Russia, to openly ignore U.S. tariffs and continue importing Russian oil. This stance was interpreted by many as an act of energy sovereignty, but also as a clear warning. Washington's dominance over other countries' decisions is weakening. What most worries ordinary citizens is that all this happens while we continue facing unstable gas prices, rising living costs, and troubling signs of an economic slowdown. The official narrative insists on protecting national security, but according to various analysts, the results indicate that we are losing strategic allies and key markets. Meanwhile, the Russian ruble has defied the bleakest predictions, stabilizing and even gaining strength against the dollar, something that just a few years ago would have seemed impossible. This recovery not only holds symbolic value but also represents a clear warning about the limits of financial punishment as a tool of power. The constant use of economic sanctions by Washington, while effective in previous decades, now produces a powerful side effect. It drives affected countries to build parallel structures beyond U.S. reach, and once underway, these structures do not easily disappear. In fact, several experts point out that each new sanction package accelerates the consolidation of alternative trade and financial systems. A tangible example is the so-called Russian shadow fleet, composed of more than 600 oil tankers that evade Western control, operating under fictitious insurance and companies, and selling crude to countries no longer fearing retaliation. These operations, facilitated by a lack of global cooperation to enforce sanctions, have allowed Moscow to maintain its energy revenues despite all restrictions. Meanwhile, debates intensify in Washington. Some sectors of Congress demand direct sanctions against China for its support to Russia, especially in supplying technology and industrial goods. But here arises a dangerous paradox. Attacking China could mean damaging the very supply chains on which the U.S. economy depends. Even in previous trade wars, tariffs on Chinese products caused price increases for millions of American consumers. Repeating that mistake with additional sanctions could cause a much more serious impact. Critics argue that the White House has fallen into a trap it created itself. The more pressure it exerts, the faster the world reorganizes against it. This reorganization goes beyond simple oil deals or payments in different currencies. It is shaping an entirely new structure in international relations. In this context, a deep concern arises about the future role of the dollar as the predominant currency, not because it will disappear, but because its capacity to function as a control tool is diminishing. Every time reserves are frozen, transfers blocked, or sanctions imposed, the world watches closely. Governments in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East wonder, if Washington can do this to Russia, why couldn't it do it to us? That systemic distrust is what drives de-dollarization today, not ideological speeches or conspiracy theories. Meanwhile, here in the United States, ordinary people see the international landscape complicating, without clarity about the tangible benefits of so much focus on trade. The general feeling is that we are pushing the world toward a new order without guaranteeing our own place in it. Shouldn't the political debate in Washington focus more on adapting to this new reality instead of insisting on defending an increasingly questioned hegemony? This is where the tension becomes unbearable. While the White House maintains a narrative of power, leadership, and control, global and even national perception dangerously drifts away from that image. What happens when the rest of the world no longer responds to our warnings? When sanctions lose their ability to intimidate, and tariffs become a boomerang directly affecting the pockets of American families? From my perspective as an ordinary citizen, this new stage is not measured only in terms of gross domestic product, trade balance, or exchange rates. It is reflected in growing anxiety on the streets, in businesses facing tighter margins, in farmers unable to export to Asian markets closed off by indirect retaliation, and in consumers seeing the prices of basic goods, from fertilizers to electronics, increase without a clear solution in sight. All this happens while Congress debates new sanctions without pausing to assess the effectiveness of those already applied. We are caught in a spiral of reactive decisions, driven more by the desire not to lose authority than by a rational long-term strategy. Many foreign policy experts warn that we are entering a phase of commercial multipolarity where old pressure mechanisms, such as unilateral sanctions or financial blockades, no longer work without coordinated backing from other powers. But that coordination has weakened. Europe, for example, after losing cheap energy supplies from Russia, has had to reinvent its industrial model and now hesitates to blindly follow every move from Washington. Even within the Western Bloc, voices demanding strategic autonomy are growing, which clearly reflects a loss of confidence. According to recent data from the International Monetary Fund, the use of the dollar in global reserves has fallen below 60% for the first time in decades. Although it remains dominant, the downward trend is steady, and this reduction does not occur in a vacuum. It happens while currencies like the Chinese yuan, the UAE dirham, and even the ruble begin to consolidate bilateral agreements, especially in the energy sector. What once seemed unthinkable, selling oil without going through the dollar, is now becoming normal. In this new scenario, what worries us most as Americans is not that other countries trade in different currencies, but that they are creating financial, logistical, and technological systems that exclude us, and this has direct consequences for our economic future. The influence of a country is measured not only by its military power or the size of its economy, but also by its ability to attract, connect, and build trust. But if we continue betting on coercive tactics without offering real proposals for cooperation, we risk becoming a feared superpower. Yes, but increasingly less influential. The most delicate case is China. So far, Trump has avoided imposing direct sanctions on the purchase of Russian oil, aware that a misstep could trigger a crisis of historic proportions. China represents the essential core of numerous supply chains, spanning technology and manufacturing to consumer goods and pharmaceutical components. Breaking that tie would mean a significant increase in inflation and the collapse of thousands of companies dependent on bilateral trade. However, maintaining this relationship without open confrontation weakens the effectiveness of the sanctions regime against Russia, making it appear fragmented and inconsistent. We find ourselves at a critical geopolitical point where every action carries significant consequences. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens remain without clear answers. We watch the ruble gain strength, India challenge our tariffs, China tighten its ties with Moscow, and former allies look at us with distrust, leaving a bitter taste. If we are losing a conflict we never even formally declared, and the world has stopped asking our permission to make decisions in areas like streets, universities, and businesses, this uncertainty grows by the moment. What is our current role in global trade? Are we still truly leaders, or are we merely reacting to changes? American rhetoric initially worked as an emotional shield, but its consequences have been profound. We have forced the world to reorganize without our participation, and that reorganization could become permanent. Therefore, as a society, voters, consumers, and citizens of the world, we must ask ourselves this: is it worth continuing to escalate a trade war we are not winning? Or is it time to reconsider our place in a global system that evolves with or without our presence? What do you think? Can the United States still dictate the rules of international trade? Or are we silent witnesses to the emergence of a new era where our decisions carry less weight than we believe?